My name is Phil Blackis. I'm an experienced design director based out of San Francisco. And as you heard, Stephen Fisher, also based out of Boston. We're both designers, design leaders, and futurists at McKinsey Design. So just a quick overview of what we're discussing today. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about speculative design, and then we're going to talk to you a little bit about what we're calling design by foresight, which is basically just how we're sort of packaging futures methodologies, strategic foresight, futures thinking at McKinsey. And then we're going to have a quick exercise and teach you guys how we do an implications wheel, or futures wheel, as it's typically called. So just a few disclaimers. Futurists, even though a lot of people are trying to depend on futures right now to predict the future, we don't ever like to use the word predict. We do not predict the future. We like to look at possible futures. We use a lot of different methodologies, including looking at trends and uncertainties, and try to figure out, what are the patterns across, outside, beyond, and figure out what does the future look like, both preferable and non-preferable futures, so we can better prepare and create strategies today. Another disclaimer, the future is typically accretive. This is Bet Shean, if you're not familiar with it. It's one of the oldest cities in the world, in Israel. It's about 6,000 years old. But when we say accretive, the future is really sort of built upon the present and the past, and it's built upon layers. This particular site has over 20 layers of civilizations over time. And typically when we look at the future, we sort of rely on things like design fiction or science fiction. And it's not always like this. It's not always clean and blue and has lens flares like J.J. Abrams or Steven Spielberg might depict it. Even though those are very attractive futures, that's not usually how it plays out. We are in the future today. 10 years ago or 20 years ago, we probably wouldn't predict that the future looked like it does today, but it does. And it's built upon many, many layers of technology and innovation and transformation. So we try to be very, very, very practical and realistic about what the future is going to look like. The COVID era has stimulated a lot of discussion and interest in futures thinking. A lot of us were blindsided by COVID, and a lot of businesses and organizations are trying to figure out how do we figure out what the next, the immediate future looks like, as well as the next 5 to 10 years, so that we're not caught by surprise again. McKinsey has done a lot of work around looking at the next normal, the next possible, but there's also a lot of organizations who are using foresight very rigorously to figure out what that time, what's going to look like, and how can we better prepare, both from a business strategy perspective, but also looking at technologies, how we can use that to future-proof our future. So as Dan said, I'm also the founder of a nonprofit organization called the Design Futures Initiative. And our focus is really on the education and advocacy of futures thinking, primarily centered around speculative design and strategic foresight. But speculative design it's a form of design, and it's best shown through examples. But this is sort of the sort of academic definition that I've used over the years. It's really a method, a framework for imagining possibilities, and through creating artifacts. And it's used to prepare us for inconvenient challenges and facilitate a more desirable, responsible path into the future. We look forward, and we look at it through the lens of design, through the creation of what are sometimes called diegetic prototypes. Diegetic prototypes is a term that has come from theater. We don't like to use the word props because it kind of seems fake, but they're really sort of provocations, artifacts, scenarios, immersive experience, visions, so that we can understand how might design play a role in the future. And if this is the future that we're heading towards, how can design actually help us have the future that we want? Stimulate discourse, ask what if, and actually present the scenarios that we want to actually live in. Speculative design, maybe in 1987, it might not have been called that, but Apple was really practicing speculative design very, very early on. You can find this video online, but this is what was called the Apple Knowledge Navigator. And this was a speculative piece of technology. And I'll show you a little bit of the video that was created. This was a vision video they created. And sorry for the low resolution, but this is something they created back then. Sorry, it's forwarded.
You have 3 messages. Your graduate research team in Guatemala, just checking in. Robert Jordan, a second semester junior, requesting a second extension on his term paper. And your mother reminding you about your father.
Surprise birthday party next Sunday.
Today you have a faculty lunch at 12 o'clock.
So as you can see, there's a touchscreen interface. There's a voice assistant. It's using the actual internet to get all this information. And it's about a 7-minute story with this professor talking to this machine. He connects with another professor around the world. And as you can tell, a lot of this technology exists today in what we call the iPad. A webcam, internet, touchscreen interface, all of that became eventually what the iPad was. Now, we don't really know if the Knowledge Navigator was the roadmap towards that, but this is the way that Apple was trying to envision the future through the lens of design, through technology, so they could figure out how might we use these technologies as they mature over time to create something that's very useful. This is a project that I always like to share in my presentations, and you can find some of my presentations online. I have a lot more examples. There's so many great examples out there of speculative design, but this one's called Transfigurations by Aggie Haynes. This is a designer baby, a child that is designed to work in longer hours in hotter climates. So in a future with climate change is more severe, the child's, the skins on the head actually allow for the heat to dissipate a lot faster. More surface area allows it to cool down faster. And it asks the questions of what if we could design our children, if we had that technology, which we do, would we do it? And so again, it's a provocation for how we might use technology in the future. Google has done a little bit of design fiction, speculative thinking as well. This is a project. I'm not going to show the video, but it's called The Selfish Ledger. And this is the ledger basically being the AI, the large brain. It has several vignettes about how the ledger might act. In this particular one, this vignette, the ledger wants to know a piece of information about its user. And that piece of information is the user's weight. How much does the user weigh? But to get this information, it basically uses all of its resources. It looks at all of the social media and preferences and 3D prints a scale in the format and aesthetic preferences that its user would like at the price point the user would like, just so they could get the user's weight. So get the user to buy the scale online and actually weigh it, and they would finally have that data point. Now, there was a lot of controversy around this video because people didn't really know that if this is a real project or a real aspiration of Google, but it was just meant to provoke discussion around like what could be done, and is this something that we want to be able to use the hive mind for? At McKinsey, we're doing a little bit of speculative thinking as well. This is a project called Omnibiotic Ecosystems. So we were looking at several different signals or trends, including input recognition devices, devices that could be implanted internally to collect data of your organs, facial recognition. And there's even a speculative biome toilet that would collect information from feces. And then number 5 is sort of the advanced AI. And a couple of different products. So if we could take all of these input recognition devices, look at biome therapy and gene therapy, what kind of products might emerge from that? How could we actually track data, and how could we actually use that to help people really understand their health? One of the speculative pieces that came out of that project is the Omnibiotic restaurant. So what if you could go to a restaurant, you stick this stick in your mouth, it would measure both your genomic signature, your biomic signature, and they would send that data back to the restaurant and actually create a menu for you that's based on your specific, unique chemical makeup. Again, all of this was very speculative, and just looking at several different trends, mashing them up together and trying to figure out what could happen, what could we do with this technology? And again, asking, is this something we want? Should we actually create a roadmap towards that North Star, or should we try to avoid it and create policies or think about ethics and think about whose data and how do we actually capture that data and start to put those infrastructures in place now so that if we do come to this future, we'll be ready for it. So design can really set agendas. It doesn't necessarily have to be in service today. That restaurant doesn't have to exist today, but we can speculate on what the world could be so we can figure out a better way to explore the world, how we want it to be or how we don't want it to be, and kind of set up those parameters today. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Steve, and he's going to tell you a little bit about Foresight and what we're doing over at McKinsey Design.
Thanks, Phil. And Phil's going to continue to drive. So wanted to kind of dive into some of the practical nature of using Foresight and the kind of modular nature that can exist if you want to utilize it. So you saw a lot of great examples, and there's a lot of great companies that are currently using Foresight. So there's a few examples. Shell is probably one of the most well-known. They really pioneered a lot of scenario planning in corporate environments back in the 80s and 90s. The people that were there came from Rand, which is where a lot of foresight and a lot of the original thought of being, futures work came from the 50s in wargaming. So it kind of has evolved. Pepsi itself had to really deal with a global changing market, just like Coca, and obviously compete with Coca-Cola and other markets that they might want to invest in or other mergers and acquisitions. And they use foresight to wield that power to think farther out. Disney, of course, we all know Disney, future thinking and Imagineers, it's about recreating culture for them. They actually have formed many teams across regions to create a level of retraining around innovation. You'll hear innovation as we go through this, but longitudinally, they did a study where many companies using this type of thinking actually helps improve their bottom line. So can you go to the next slide? So let's talk about foresight for a sec. So foresight itself, the term has been around a while. Strategic foresight is a term you hear, used in a lot of places. You also hear futures work, futures strategic foresight. Generally, it's a discipline that brings together trends and issues we call signals and mapping out scenarios and looking at things toward different horizons. So that in a general sense, when you look at it with the design aspect of it, in our case, we call it design times foresight. We use it as an innovation approach to imagine possible futures, make things tangible, and bringing the foresight and the design methodologies together in the process. Next slide. So how do we do that? So the way we do it is that foresight amplifies the impact of design. So if you're kind of moving left to right here, you look at this human-centered approach, which we're all familiar with is work, even if for designers here on the call. Then there's this aspect that we call the domains. So there's many different structures of it, but this one we call STEEP, which is going to be important in a minute when we get to the workshop aspect of this talk. So social, technological, economic, environmental, and political. There's a lot of others that might go along with that, but these are the core in which we look through the lens of various trends and signals. So what do I mean by signals? Well, if you look at this, that we're in the present, we always want to look at the history because you want to look for patterns and cycles. And as you look toward the future will eventually become the present. It's a question of how that will really evolve and when it will mature. Things will pop in your mind as things that are coming in the future. So we look at signals and look at the strength of those things that are going to impact the future at various timeframes. And as we look at possible futures, we incorporate that to inform strategies that are happening today, but will be happening potentially in the future. Next slide. So the real thing that you want to keep in mind here is there's a lot of great activities you can do. There's a ton of tools out there just to kind of keep it at a very straightforward level. I mentioned trends. So we look at that past and present and what's happening. And when I say trends, these are things that are happening that are informed by data, right? The signals that are happening, and there's also drivers that are out there, like, electric cars, general things that are happening. Scenarios we look at, and we'll get into it a little later, these are the possible futures. These could be more dystopian, these could be very egalitarian, they could be all shapes and sizes, but they are possible futures and they help inform as that eventual future becomes the present. So as we go through the models, we'll look at concept development. How do we take those ideas and put them into something that is tangible? And this is where speculative design, what Phil talked about, is so key, because it's not just about imagining, it's about the actual, like, putting your hands onto something. With that, it allows us to look in that future and backcast. This means looking backward. And this is the different horizons when things will evolve, and helps you really map out as those futures become the present, as a kind of a roadmap, if you will. Next slide. This is a bit deeper of a dive. I won't kind of talk it through, talk to the slide, but you can see that you want to frame, perform research, and synthesize that. And when you do trend work, then as you're envisioning those scenarios and creating the concepts, the roadmap itself will create different, you could even call them milestones, we call them indicators, these things that help you, see when things are unfolding.
So at McKinsey this year, I guess sometime around May, we took on a project to look at what the next normal patient experience would be post-COVID. Now that's a very general investigation because there's lots of different types of patient therapies, but we wanted to kind of take a wide net at first and look at what's it going to take, what's it going to look like both in the near term, the next 6 to 12 months, what does that post-COVID or intra-COVID era look like, but also the next 2 to 5 years. And we did, of the 4 conceptual frameworks, we did a bunch of trend research analysis. We interviewed doctors, other experts in the healthcare industry and pharma industry, and we created a number of scenarios. We prioritized those trends with our experts and said, which of the trends do you think are going to be the most important to be thinking about? And some of the ones that really bubbled up to the top were around remote care and remote treatment, and also caring for the vulnerable and the elderly. Of course, this is very obvious then, but this is back in May, mind you. This is at the beginning of the crisis. And we also did a number of implications. We did several of them for several different trends. This one on the right here is just for the need for remote delivery of services and treatment. And that allowed us to create a number of scenarios. And this is a framework called the axis of uncertainty. And you basically put two different, on each axis, 2 different types of trends. So this one, we thought, well, what is actually the public's going to really care about when they're going to seek treatment in the post-COVID era? And really just from public sentiment, it's around like, are the cases increasing or decreasing? And is the treatment available or not available? For any type of demographic or population, these are the things that really matter to them on if they're going to trust vaccines and if they're going to continue to leave their home and get treatment. And we had these 4 different scenarios: caution, growth, collapse, and recovery. Growth is like, everything's great. Cases are declining, treatment's available, we're back to normal. And it's sort of the hockey stick all the way up to the top right. The inverse of that is the collapse. Cases increasing, no treatment available, continued collapse of economies and healthcare systems. This is the recovery card, which is actually more, this is sort of like what's going on right now. Some cases are increasing. We're sort of in the second wave, but a treatment or vaccine is available and getting ready for distribution. So we can start to, now this is a world that we've created based on a lot of different dimensions. We used STEEP, we used a lot of other healthcare dimensions as well. Now we can build within this world. If this is the world that's going to come, we can create speculative designs, we can create visions, we can create other kinds of scenarios to help our clients figure out what do we need to do to prepare for that recovery era. And so we didn't actually have particular clients. We're talking with clients right now, but what we ended up with were a number of how might we cards. So these were cards we would take to the client, start the conversation, say, hey, look, we've been thinking about the future. How might we, based on these scenarios, think about remote delivery or caring for the vulnerable in specific contexts? And we would show it to them and have that conversation. And we would use these as launching points. Or we would say, okay, let's start from the very beginning based on your particular therapy, like oncology. We did a particular journey map just for a pan-tumor cancer patient. And so we can start from the very beginning and say, let's look at all the trends and implications for your particular type of patient therapy and go from there. But we did both the near term because everyone was really concerned with the near term. How do we prepare for the immediate reopening of service? And also the next 2 to 5 years. So the next 2 to 5 years, maybe there's autonomous care and treatment delivery. We've got robots coming to the home that are administering different types of cancer treatments, or robots in the clinic as well, just to reduce the human contact.